All right, folks, welcome back to Mike Maurice's Mind Escape. We have episode number 187 tonight. We are joined by author and researcher Chris Bennett. You can check out his stuff. I have the links down below. He's written some articles and on Soma, cannabis, ancient cannabis use, and they're really well written. So go check those out. He's also written a couple books. One of them being Cannabis and the Soma Solution, and the other more recent one being Liber 420. Again, I have the links down below. Check those out. This is going to be part one of a few-part series here. We're going to discuss cannabis as being, the potential for what Soma was, and Chris is the perfect person for that. He seems to have done probably the most research out of anybody I've seen lately on the subject. So, again, check out his work. If before we get started here, head on over to our Patreon at patreon.com/mindescapepodcast for just $2 a month. You'll get exclusive guest episodes and segments. If you're not a Patreon member, for $2, you get basically a whole nother catalog of episodes. So if you like our show, head on over to our Patreon. We really appreciate it. Shout out to our new Secret Escapee tier member, Lou. We really appreciate your support. So shout out to Lou. And one more thing before we get started here, head on over to Indra's Web. IndrasWeb.org is an app that we created, a platform where you can talk about all this kind of stuff. It's a social network for open minds. So if you have a hypothesis, theory, speculation on anywhere from ancient psychedelic use to megalithic structures, physics, whatever it is, head on over there. That's where the discussion's happening. So without further ado, welcome on the show, Chris.
Hey, pleasure to be here, man.
Great to have you on.
Joining us.
I know we tried to set this up.
He's the god of cannabis, so god of Soma. So that's kind of appropriate.
Yeah, for sure.
Soma,
Yeah, if you read our blog, there's actually a psychedelic inspiration behind the name too, and obviously it's a analogy that's been used by Alan Watts, and obviously that goes all the way back to ancient times. So
yeah. Very good one for the internet, with kind of like a jewel at each interconnection of the web.
Yeah, we got to get you on there, man. I think we're trying to build it slow and get a nice slow grow going, but I like what I'm seeing on there with the type of thinking and research that people are doing. So I think it's fine to do research on alternative or fringe topics, but you got to really put the work in to find those little niches there.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's get this thing started. So we're here to talk about Soma. You've written, a couple books on the topic, and you've written a bunch of articles. Why don't you tell us how you got interested in that specific, topic or subject, and then how it's evolved kind of to where you are now?
Sure. About a little over 30 years ago, I had this powerful spiritual experience on cannabis, and trying. Oh, there we go. You're back. Disappeared for a second.
You're good.
Okay. I started researching the role of cannabis in magic and religion, figuring if there was anything to my experience, then other people would have had some sort of effect like this as well. And so I started slowly researching cannabis. For a long time, in regards to Soma, I just assumed, the work of R. Gordon Wasson was just so established. Whenever the topic came up, anybody I talked to convinced me that this was Amanita muscaria, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I didn't, in my first two books, Green Gold, The Tree of Life, Marijuana and Magic and Religion, Sex, Drugs, Violence in the Bible, I just kind of went with that idea. And it wasn't until later, when some archaeological material started showing up, that I started questioning this identification and looking closer at the matter, and I think that's really it. I think that the archaeological information is there in combination with the textual information that makes a case for cannabis as Soma. And this has to do with a lot of archaeology that's emerged in the last 10, 20 years. Paramount to this is cannabis's role in Indo-European and Proto-Indo-European society, right? Like there's Soma in the Vedic religion and Heoma in the Avestan religion, and this is what the Avestan religion is what later became the Zoroastrian religion, right? And the Vedic religion later became Hinduism, but they have a common ancestry based on the sacred beverages of both of these religions that inspired the poets that wrote the texts of the Vedas and the Avesta. And this is being the Heoma and the Avesta and the Soma in the Veda. And they know that there's this common ancestry because of the similarity in language, Indo-European dialects, as well as mythology and stuff like that in the text. So they come from this earlier Indo-European origins, right? And when we take a look at Indo-European and Proto-Indo-European culture and cannabis, it's like an astounding thousands of years of ritual use. And we can follow this all the way back to where we now know is the Proto-Indo-European homeland, because this has been designated by DNA evidence. And this is the steppes region of Russia, and coming into places like Romania and Ukraine. And this is where the horse developed as well. Horse riding was domesticated, and it's believed that horse riding was in fact domesticated because of the development of hemp rope, right? And we have, evidence of hemp rope, going back like 25,000 years in Czechoslovakia, right? You know what I mean? And you got to think like even by like 10, 12,000 years, we have simultaneous industries go, hemp being made into fiber cloth and stuff like that. 10, 12,000 years in Taiwan, 10, 12,000 years in Kalahaya, So this is like very divergent cultures that are already making hemp cloth. So it's so old, right? And when we take a look at the Proto-Indo-Europeans in Ukraine and Romania, going back like 5,500 years, 5,000 years ago, they found evidence of cannabis being burnt at funerary sites, right? And funerary rituals, in smoking cups and bowls, little braziers like this, right? Mm-hmm. And this is a practice that is in Indo-European culture and widespread for thousands of years later. We can see this at Scythian sites. Herodotus, the Greek historian, wrote like 450 BC, wrote about Scythians throwing cannabis seeds on hot stones and inhaling the fumes. You got to remember in these ancient references, when they're talking about cannabis seeds, they're talking about seeded buds with calyxes on them and stuff like that. And the calyxes have all the THC and resins that you find on buds. They didn't know anything about sensibilia back then.
Right.
And we know that this is the case because at numerous archaeological sites in southern Russia and in Poland and places like that, they've discovered Scythian tombs and braziers used for burning hemp seeds and burning cannabis in the exact same way that Herodotus describes. And this is in braziers and in a little teepee-like structure. And they throw the cannabis on the hot stones. They put their head in the teepee and they hotbox their heads in there with the smoke, right? And now this is interesting because we've also got the example out of central China of the Indo-European mummies that were found there. And this is the Jushi culture that was in central China from about 2000 BC to about 400 BC when the indigenous Han Chinese chased them out of there. And they found cannabis and ephedra in a number of tombs there, right? Mm-hmm. And we're talking, processed female cannabis flowers, picked out stems and stuff like that, about a pound or so in a basket, whole bouquets of female cannabis flowers. This is high resin content cannabis, right? It was still very well preserved because of the climate here, very cold and dry, right? And other evidence of cannabis, but they've also found braziers that were used in the exact same way the Scythians were, far distance away from where this is at, right? And but in this case, it was wooden braziers found at multiple tombs where cannabis was thrown on it in these funerary rituals, identical to these Scythian rituals, right? And so this, and then when you get over into Europe, there's been cannabis found at all sorts of Celtic burial sites and stuff like that. So there's likely a relationship there as well. And so how this relates to Soma is that these Indo-Europeans in China, they were part of a trade network, the Silk Road, we know it as, but it might have well called it a hempen highway because there's a lot of cannabis flowing on this trade route as well, right? And we know that they were in contact with this other site called the Bactria Margiana Archaeological Complex. And this is in Afghanistan, And there's a Russian archaeologist, Victor Sarianidi, and he has found what he says are 3 sites that were Heoma Soma temples. And he says that these sites, half the temple site was dedicated to the preparation of the sacred beverage. And he found evidence indicating cannabis and ephedra, but also in one of the sites, opium poppies were also found, right? Now, there's been debate about Sarianadi's archaeological finds because, he's working on a Russian budget in the 80s and 90s and stuff like that, which isn't like, what you might expect from some American universities or European universities, right? And they're working with stuff in the open sunlight. And they found residues of what they said were cannabis and ephedra and impressions of cannabis seeds in gypsum that was in the bottom of pots that he says was used for the grinding and preparation of this Soma beverage, right? Other archaeologists, a couple of years after this claim came out, asked for some samples, and they were unable to reproduce Sarianidi's finds. So unfortunately, it's in a bit of controversy. But it's interesting still because of the relationship with his Chinese finds, but also with the Scythians, who I mentioned earlier in regard to braziers, because the Scythians not only burnt cannabis, they drank cannabis. And they found a bone cup with cannabis residues in it, a wineskin with residues in it, and golden goblets that had residues of cannabis and opium in it now. And Sarianidi says that the Scythians were often the deliverers of cannabis to this Bactria Margiana archaeological complex sites, and they were interacted with the people there in trade routes and stuff. Now, one of the names of the Scythians in this region was the Heoma Varga, means the Heoma gatherers. And ancient authors write about how they burnt Heoma as well as drank it, So, and now what's interesting here is we go back to China with these other Indo-Europeans known as the Jushi. And in that region, there's a Chinese name for cannabis at this time, Huma. And Huma means either fire, hemp, or Scythian cannabis. And it refers to the stuff that these guys had as opposed to what a lot of the other cannabis that was around in China was more for fiber and seed purposes, right? At the same time, though, we start to see Taoist references to the plant of immortality, cannabis. This is what Soma is, still plant of immortality. A lot of similar mythology. And Mandy Hassan, a linguist, has suggested that the term huma, which can also be applied to ephedra, cannabis and ephedra have a unique relationship in this name. And this is what that Sarianidi was claiming this Soma Heoma was made from, right? And Mandy Hassan's theory is that in the transportation of this, it came with a name from this region, Huma. And this Huma became Heoma, and then through further linguistic changes becomes Soma as this goes into India, right? And when we look at the period like when Soma's disappearing in Vedic India, when they're starting to lose the identity, a lot of it has to do with the importation of it and the poor quality and lack of it, right? And cannabis isn't indigenous to that region of India. They know this from pollen samples of Indian soil and things like that. And so it's believed that it came with the Aryans who brought Soma with them, right? And so
I was going to actually ask you too. You were mentioning, Russian archaeology. Didn't they not find? I guess this would be one to kind of, not a contradictory, but they found the mural that has two people standing over a fire, and one of them looks like he's
I don't
holding
know.
a
I'm not too
mushroom.
impressed by that.
So what do you think's going on
like
there?
A tattered mural. It's like based on what Vedic description of Soma or Haoma, because both in the Avesta and in the Vedas, there's clear descriptions of Soma. And part of what Wasson did is like the most vivid descriptions are given in the 10th mandala of the Rig Veda. And
right.
Wasson tried to claim that this was one of the later books of the Veda. So by this time it had been lost, and they were talking about a substitute, because in the 10th mandala of the Rig Veda describes Soma as a green and purple tree, and describes the stones used for pressing Soma being turned green from smashing it, right? You know what I mean? In a very similar way to where to the preparation of bhang is in India, right? The term bhang is an epithet of Soma in the Vedas, because it can also mean breaking, right? But it's the same word.
I was going to ask you too about it says the elixir was strained through wool and that it was mixed with milk and water. Now, anybody that's made edibles knows that cannabis is fat, So that's how it binds. So, is that possibly why they used milk? Because I always wondered that with Soma, like what was the purpose?
Yeah, well, that's likely, but they do make bhang even with straight water and are able to get an effect out of it in India. You got to remember, all this cannabis too, it's not like fresh cannabis. This is like imported into India and stuff like that. And UV light, sunlight, will convert THCA into THC. So it's all psychoactive, right? You don't have to heat it or anything like that, although there's indications that in some cases there's heating processes.
So you think just the UV light would have kind of decarbed it so that when they...
Oh, yeah, UV light and age for sure would have decarbed it. Absolutely. Absolutely. If you dry cannabis in sunlight, that's what it was like. It made all that Acapulco gold and Colombian gold was like the way they dried it and shit, right? Is in sunlight. This is like science knows this, right? You know what I mean? Cannabis science knows this, that it converts it.
So I've made a Venn diagram too for some of the later parts we're going to do on this. I mean, like I said, I've researched this pretty heavily too, and I like what you have to say about it. And obviously, you have a lot of empirical data and research that you've provided. But what about the contradictions? Because there is contradictions in descriptions, and not only that, but Soma is considered a god in part of the Rig Veda, and like a deity, or so there's like different weird components of this that
there's it's the moon in the sky, like a big pizza pie.
That's amore, baby.
Yeah, that's the cup of Soma, of the gods, right? And a lot of the rituals are based around the cycles of the moon. And as it drains, the gods are drinking the Soma, and as it fills up, it's replenished, right? And this is what Wasson turned to for a lot of his descriptions, right? Is these references to Soma as the moon in the sky. It's pictured as a chariot, it is in the sky, like the moon, traveling through the sky, right? And then it's also a plant, and it's a drink, there is, right? I think a really important thing here is to see what indigenous Indian scholars have to say about Soma and the Vedic stuff, right?
There's a few YouTube videos I've watched that there are people that have certain takes on it for sure that I've seen. Yeah.
Well, and it's best to get translations that aren't done by somebody that's come from some particular camp, and it's important to remember that Wendy Doniger, who did a lot of the translations for Wasson's book on Soma, never accepted Amanita muscari as a candidate. She didn't think that was correct, right? And
didn't Wasson, towards the end of his life, too, kind of change his mind after he was talking with Terence McKenna and stuff, and was kind of convinced that it might have even just been psilocybe?
Well, there's weak stuff with it. For one thing, Wasson discounts the whole 10th mandala because he says, that was, after even though it's written in Sanskrit and it's part of the Vedic, thing, and this is what Vedic scholars say about it, he knocks it out of the equation because with it, he has no case, because there's clear descriptions of it as a plant in the 10th mandala of the Veda. He did the same thing with the Avestan descriptions of Haoma, where it's described as green and a plant-like substance, definitely not a mushroom. He said, that's after. Those guys already lost it, But then for the idea that because the active chemicals of fly agaric mushrooms can pass through into the urine, he goes to a text written like 1,500 years after the Vedic period,
Yeah.
and talks about some text there where somebody drinks some pee, from a beggar God disguised as a beggar, right? And that's just like that's pretty ludicrous, because there's like this whole history of ritual urine consumption, and Hinduism and Ayurveda, the Tibetan thing. It's like a yogic practice in some cases.
Yeah,
it has nothing to do with psychoactivity.
Is the Amanita stuff? Yeah, I was going to ask though, with the reindeer stuff, is there really, is that really? I know they've shown videos of like reindeer looking through the snow to eat them and stuff like that. I'm not really concerned with the whole Santa correlations or anything like that. Doesn't really interest me, because even if that was true, what does that even mean? It's still, a made up, archetype, So for me, the interesting part though is if these reindeer are eating them and people are drinking them and having, obviously you need to decarb Amanita muscaria to get rid of the ibotanic acid and all that. So, is that what was going on there? Were they aware of that, do you think? Like, we have to wait till it passes through this reindeer or this person or something like that?
Yeah, I really don't know enough about it. You know what I mean? And it's like, I don't even know that ancient fly agaric use is established. You know what I mean? The shamanic use in Siberia, maybe just centuries old for all I know. I don't know of any ancient texts referred to it. They've certainly known about it for some centuries, Right. People were writing about it in the 18th century. So, there was some knowledge of it, pretty much, the only mushroom that people were writing about as psychoactive substances prior, to R. Gordon Wasson going down to Mexico was the fly agaric. There's no like clear knowledge, evidence in history books at least, whereas clear psilocybin, there's a lot of speculation.
You can't see behind me, but I have, because I have a UC green screen, but I have Selva Passalaqua behind me with the little psilocybes in the corner. So I do, what do you think about that? Not to get too far off topic here, but what do you think about?
I don't know. What is that? It's
like, in Spain. It's like I think a 7,000 or 8,000 year old cave painting where it's clearly
Yeah. Well, that stuff's cool. It is interesting. And
there's one in Algeria too, I think.
Yeah,
there's one in Algeria that's, I think, 9,000 years old as well. That's clearly psilocybe.
Yeah. I'm not against it, but I'm just saying, as far as like textual references, and we've got a lot of like things that have been written about in ancient texts and medieval and Renaissance texts: mandrake, henbane, opium, cannabis. You know what I mean?
I'm with you though. I don't think
even,
I don't think the descriptions are really conducive as far as Soma goes with psilocybin or psilocybe. It just doesn't. I'm very well aware of all these different little nuances, and I don't see anything in there. There's a lot of green, a lot of gold. Some of the similarities you mentioned, they're pressed, between Soma and Homa. The medicinal properties, the yellow and gold, derived from the Indo-Iranian Soma, being drank before battle and assisting warriors. That one's kind of interesting because...
Well, there is like ephedra is still used, right? As Heoma and Soma, you know what I mean? And that's what is interesting about what Sarianati brought to the table was that that it was a combination, and there's references to the twins in the preparation of Soma as well, right? And there's this unique kind of yin-yang kind of relationship between cannabis and ephedra in China, right? You know what I mean?
Right.
So that I think is interesting as well. And an argument for it as well, right?
Yeah, just like I said, I've made Venn diagrams, looked at the differences. There are similarities too. I've personally, and we'll talk about this as the parts go on, I've personally come to the conclusion that this was mostly, to me, it seems like an entheogen mixed with a ritual, and that was what was known as Soma. I look at it more of like Soma as being the word psychedelic or drug. And then,
I think that's what happened. You know what I mean? And
so you think like the split off or something?
Came to be came to be imbibed as Soma and invoked as Soma, you know what I mean? That had the prayers of Soma. And, it eventually became kind of more of a generic term, right? It clearly becomes lost at a certain point or inaccessible. And they talk about Soma substitutes and things like that, right? So it became more of a ritual. I think in the very origins, there's that linguistic argument that I discussed, right? But we're talking about long stretches of time here, right?
Right.
You know what I mean? And centuries, and the trade routes here too are really fascinating. It affected other religions as well, right? We have the, we know the Scythians were in Israel, and there's a town there, Scythopolis, right? And we know the ancient Israelites in 8th century BC were burning cannabis in a very similar way to the Scythians in a small enclosed chamber and burning it on an altar. And this is all proven by archaeology. Yeah. It's something I was suggesting through etymological evidence for decades, right? Through the Hebrew term cannabosum, which is the adoption of the Indo-European term for canna, another name that cannabis traveled around with, right?
They just found physical evidence, though, within the last year, right? There's been some articles.
Yeah, it's amazing. Yeah, it came out last June. Unfortunately, COVID and all the riots and stuff kind of overplayed it, but it's starting to sink in, the potential relevance. That's not the only evidence out of the Holy Land either, right? They have evidence from Bet Shemesh, Israel, of topical and burnt cannabis used for medical purposes from the 4th century AD. So that's like a 1,200-year spread, right? And this is all interrelated, I think, with what was happening with Soma as well, right? And, Professor Patrick McGovern is probably like the foremost expert on the history of alcohol. He thinks that Soma was actually cannabis and ephedra infused in wine, which is an interesting theory, because we have the later accounts, Zoroastrian religion with Haoma went through some really heavy reforms. The prophet Zoroaster, who kind of took it from a polytheistic religion into a sort of monotheism, he was very uptight about the all-night orgies and rituals that were taking place with Haoma. You can imagine with ephedra, which is the base for methamphetamine.
So do you think, though, that's where you get the battle, for the warriors and that aspect of it when you see it in text? Do you think that's the part of it is the ephedra part?
Well, the ephedra kept being used. But it certainly would have kept people awake for the all-night parties. The interesting thing in Zoroastrianism is ephedra is still used. It's more of a poured-out offering rather than something people drink, but it is drunk by some Zoroastrian priests. But it's just a mild stimulant in that preparation, right? But Zoroaster took it through reforms. But then what happens in Zoroastrianism is cannabis comes back again as an infusion in wine. And in the Denkard and other texts, they talk about figures like Vishtaspa and Ardu Viraf. Ardu Viraf, he saw heaven and hell under the influence of this cannabis-infused wine. Vishtaspa saw the end of the world, kind of the prototype for the Book of Revelation under it, right?
That's where we get the whole light versus dark, the kind of Zoroastrianism's known as like the first real religion.
Yeah, it's a big influence on both Christianity and Judaism in numbers of ways, right? And in Gnostic texts, Jesus even refers to Zoroaster by name, right? Real big influence in Zoroastrian religions, right? There's a lot of similarities between the Eucharist and Soma. This is like the subject of the recent book, The Immortality Key, as well. And I've talked about this in my book. And this may have come through Mithraism, it may have come through Dionysian influences, may have well come through even earlier Jewish influences, because we know the Jews, they would give incense in wine to the prisoner on his way to execution, heal his pain. And Amos talks about this same sort of the wine of the condemned being drunk by the priests in the temple. You know what I mean? So it's obviously theogenic as well, right? But when Alexander the Great went into India, he saw people there. This is like 4th century BC. He saw the people there pressing grapes to Indra, the goddess Soma, right?
Boom. Indra's web, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah. And it's interesting because Dionysius and Shiva the worshippers of Dionysius with Alexander, and the local worshippers of Shiva, who's also deeply involved with the whole Soma thing. They recognized that their god was the same god, and this is written about by ancient authors, from the time of Alexander onward, that Dionysius and Shiva were the same god. Alexander thought he'd found the childhood home of Dionysius when he went into India. So this is a pretty fascinating connection. And, Dionysius, he comes from, the worship of Dionysius starts in Thrace, and both Mircea Eliade and Erwin Rhodes, a well-known German Greek classicist, they both suggested cannabis use in the cult of Dionysius in Thrace. They have priests there known as the Capnobatai, those who walk and smoke, and again, a real close relationship with the Scythians. And we know Dionysius was worshipped by some Scythians because we have artifacts like a gold rhyton with Scythian's head on, with Dionysius' head on it, found in a Scythian tomb, and other artifacts representing Dionysius found at Scythian sites, right? And so they may as well. This is another thing that Patrick McGovern says, is they were drinking cannabis-infused wines, right? And so this is a bit of an argument for McGovern, what he's saying. I think that would have been a later development, but again, we're talking about long periods of time here, right? And a lot of this stuff went out the wayside in India when Buddhism came about. Buddhism was a major reformer. Vegetarianism, the ban on alcohol, and the disappearance of Soma is all due to the sobering influence of Buddhism on the Vedic religion.
How far back do you look at, do you go? I know there's been some articles about tens of thousands of years ago, there's some possible evidence of cultivation in the Tibetan plains of cannabis and things of that.
Oh, that's millions of years ago.
Yeah, millions,
that's when it originated.
Right. But I'm just saying,
I think it originated. Oldest evidence, that I know of in regards to archaeology, cloth-wise would be Elizabeth Whalen Barber, who's probably the foremost authority on ancient textiles, has said that she's seen tools that are used for breaking hemp fibers from the stalks that go back 28,000 years.
Wow.
There's a claim of hemp rope found in Czechoslovakia, 25,000 years, right? And this is all in the time period of what's known as the Great Leap Forward. And Dr. Jeffrey Guy of GW Pharmaceuticals and Dr. John McPartland, another well-known cannabis researcher, they have an excellent theory about how cannabis could have played a role in the Great Leap Forward when things like fire and the wheel and these sorts of technologies may have taken place.
So it's stoned ape with actual cannabis.
Yeah, stoned ape. Yeah. I think that is Terence McKenna's greatest contribution to the psychedelic discussion, was bringing in Julian Jaynes' Origins of Consciousness theory with psychedelics, because it fits so well. It doesn't have to be mushrooms necessarily. Not to discount mushrooms. I'm not against evidence for mushrooms. The cave paintings I think are very intriguing, stuff like that. I just
and on the psychedelic chart, they're the most biologically safe, if you will.
Yeah. I just think there's a lot of loose claims going around these days based around mushrooms. I'm not a big fan of basing an argument just on iconography or something in a painting. You know what I mean? You're looking at some medieval painting and that could be a mushroom, and so Jesus used mushroom 1600 years earlier, and there's some secret brotherhood, but nothing ever got written down about it. You know what I mean?
Well, but it isn't like
that sort of.
The cave art, though, I will point out, though, when you have a bull or a cow and then you have the psilocybe clearly, in the same mural, and it's art that has never been, to that point discovered.
That's a little more convincing.
Yeah.
That's a little more convincing than some of the stuff, say, like people like Mike Crowley or Jerry Brown are throwing around.
So you're talking about the stained glass stuff and all the
that sort of thing, or the paracels are a big thing in Buddhist art, Tibetan Buddhist art, kind of an umbrella thing, and Crowley's continually saying these are representative mushrooms, but they've got their own history of this type of stuff, and you can go into Tibetan Buddhist literature of the 10th and 12th century, you can find all sorts of references to cannabis and datura and other substances. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Why they were clearly had texts where they're referring to the role of psychoactive substances. Unfortunately, they don't indicate anything like mushrooms, but there's certainly other plenty of hallucinogenic and cannabis and other things in there for sure.
Right. I mean, you also have to think about too, would some of these ancient people, like maybe if they found dried, psilocybe on, near in a paddy field or something like that, then, they needed to eat it or something like that. I could see that. But it's like even somebody back then, if you would have to eat a decent amount of fresh to, so you would have to kind of know. So, I mean, obviously we've been around for a long time, 200,000 years as Homo sapiens sapiens. So, I mean, there's been a lot of time for, I'm sure, exploring and trying and, hey, Maurice, don't eat that one over there. We know, John, last week, or whatever. So, so there's probably been a lot of that. But I agree with you. I think that when you're looking at ancient psychedelic use or entheogenic use, nowadays it seems like there are a lot of things to cross-reference, and it seems like people just want to take whatever sensational headline pops up first as opposed to like really digging deep into it. And I'm not saying it's not, I think it's there. I just think that the specifics are kind of blurry and people just want to latch on to whatever the narrative is at the time or whatever.
Yeah, it's easy to present something like, so few people know even what Soma is, let alone have read through the Vedic literature and stuff like that. But,
I'm a nerd.
People will base their opinion on it based on their own drug experiences. You know what I mean? Well, I had a really powerful experiences on mushrooms, so it's clearly what these people are talking about. You got to kind of put those kind of biases aside and look at other, like textual descriptions, other historical evidence, archaeology, all that type of stuff, I think is, and combine that with that self-knowledge as well.
Right. What I wanted to ask you too is like, what about like some of the, I don't know, what do you call them? They're not stanzas, but they're like little poetry segments. I mean, what do you call them in the Rig Veda? I don't know. I think there's a word for it.
Well, the whole thing's kind of, I don't know, stanza is probably a good word for them. I don't know. The whole thing is written like poetry. You know
right.
what I mean?
But there's some that, like, talk about obtaining light and immortality. And like, there's certain things that like seem like, I mean, I don't know. I'm a big, it's recreationally legal here. I never thought I would see that here in Chicago. It's recreationally legal where we're from in Detroit, where Maurice is. I know it's recreationally legal where you are in Canada. So, I mean, we're in a different time now for sure. But I think that when you look at these descriptions, I mean, while edibles will definitely take you to other places and whatever however you're ingesting.
Well, we are talking about ingested cannabis here, in regards to Soma, right?
Right.
I mean, it's a drink, right?
Right.
And bong can be very powerful. I think in that regard, it's cannabis hands down. I guarantee you that nobody can even produce a quarter as much accounts of religious experiences through the ages in any other entheogen that could be recorded in regards to cannabis. We have existing religions where cannabis is used. Right. Cannabis is still taken by sadhus to get that feeling of nirvana or samadhi. They'll smoke some chillum before sitting down to do their yogic practices. And same with dervishes. In the 19th century, there's loads of accounts of them seeking oblivion of the ego through the consumption of large amounts of cannabis.
I'm glad you brought that up.
Rastafarians, as well, right? So, Africa as well, there's like lots of tribes where cannabis is venerated as a spiritual thing, right? You got to remember, we've been introduced, a lot of this is set and setting as well, right? And we've been introduced culturally different to cannabis, and I think Tom Hatsis made a good point when he said, well, compared to how a lot of these ancient peoples were doing it, we're microdosing, right? And the first medical anesthetic was cannabis-infused wine, in China. And they were performing complicated operations on knocked out people. You can throw somebody in a full-on catalytic state with cannabis tinctures, where their body just freezes up like rigor mortis, their breath drops down, and they go into a kind of a state of hibernation, right? And when these accounts of the Zoroastrian figures like Vistaspa and Ardu-Virov drinking cannabis-infused wine, they're knocked out for 48 hours, man. People thought they were like dead, Similar accounts with the Hashisheen, they thought they died and they'd wake up somewhere else. They passed right out. So, this was something that the Thukis in India did as well. They gave people cannabis infusions and knocked them out cold and robbed them and murdered them, These are worshippers of Kali in India. That's where we get the name thug from, right? So you can make really, really potent infusions of cannabis, right? So you can't really compare. And then you can take a look at the 19th century occult scene. Like Aleister Crowley, he had his first experience of samadhi under the influence of hashish. It's all over. Blavatsky, all these different occultists were using it. The 19th century scene, particularly in France, Eliphas Levi, all these figures wrote about cannabis and hashish-infused wines and stuff like that. This was a major fueling point for spiritual experience. And that was like taking things out of the dull, dry Victorian era into this living experience of religion for the first time in centuries in Europe, right?
Yeah, I mean, I at this point, I've been smoking, vaping, ingesting for over 20 years. My go-to compound, and then I guess my other go-to would be psilocybin. Those are my two favorite. I just feel at home with them. But in terms of, you mentioned ego dissolution and this feeling, I don't think a lot of people realize, if you're a regular user or, whatever, you don't recognize how powerful these compounds are actually. And if you take a break, tolerance break or whatever the case may be and come back to it, it's like, whoa. But I've even had instances, hitting some live resin from a pen or something like that, where I call it scary high. It's not really scary. It's just an aware, you're hyper aware at that moment. And it's similar to when you come down off of psilocybin and you're like, I got to get my life in order. I got to get my shit together. You can definitely get that feeling from cannabis. And I don't think enough people talk about that.
Yeah, I was with somebody one time using some really strong cannabis, and they had what I would say was like a waking dream. Their consciousness was the same as it was when you have a dream, where the unreal could be completely real for an hour. And then they kind of came back to reality, right? And there's this interesting relationship between cannabis and the unconscious and subconscious. The unconscious and subconscious were actually defined through cannabis experimentation. We have people like Dr. J.J. Moreau, a member of the Club des Hashishins, with Victor Hugo, Alexander Dumas, Théophile Gautier, Dean Raval, and other figures. But he wrote a book about cannabis and madness because he was saying that, well, this is like when we dream or when we go insane, right? And they were trying to understand what this was in relation to that, right? And Young, he wrote he gave a whole essay about Dean Raval, who was a major figure in the Club des Hashishins, as an example of somebody where the unconscious or subconscious raised up too quick. And there's an interesting relationship between cannabis and dreaming, right? I've looked up cannabis and melatonin. And in the 80s, they were doing experiments, and they found that people using cannabis would spike their daytime melatonin levels by 2,000 times its regular daytime levels.
I don't dream unless it's lucid and I go back to sleep. That's usually the only time I dream.
Yeah. And that may be why people don't dream at night, because they're spiking their melatonin all day if you use a lot of cannabis, and then your melatonin is depleted at night. But I've noticed this other effect where I've gotten up at 4 a.m. and I've smoked cannabis and I've gone back to bed and had the most intense, vivid, interactive dreams that I've ever had.
That's interesting.
And I think it's due to this same spike in melatonin. And I think this is why that you see in magic, cannabis was used a lot with magic mirrors, because and this is there's 3 16th century grimoires that refer specifically to using cannabis for seeing spirits and demons in magic mirrors. This is right in the time of John Dee, right? And there's indications of drug use in John Dee's writings as well. But there's the Sefer Raziel, Liber Salomonis, the Book of Oberon, and the Cunning Man's Grimoire. All make reference to the use of cannabis for seeing magic mirrors. We see this in the 19th century with figures like Dr. Pascal Beverly Randolph and the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor, which formed from Randolph. They took cannabis as soma. And Louis Alphonse Cagné and other figures using cannabis with magic mirrors. And I think that this is kind of interesting because what it is the magic mirror is a tool for interacting with the subconscious or unconscious. And what these people were doing is getting the kind of effect, who is it that tells us our dreams at night? We're in the dream. We're being told the dream. We're all the other characters in the dream. That's us and our unconscious or subconscious mind interacting. And I think the same spike in melatonin that was, causing this sort of access in dreaming was probably why that it was used in magic as well, as for accessing, the revealer of our dreams, the narrator of our dreams in magic mirrors.
Yeah, that's interesting. And actually, we've had Dr. Rick Strassman on the show before, and he talked about how he was actually studying melatonin, which led him to all of his DMT research and the pineal gland and all that stuff. So I think that melatonin does play a massive role, obviously, not just in our, sleep cycles and things like that.
I used to be friends with Strassman. I knew him in the 90s. He came and visited me out when I lived in this little fishing town on Vancouver Island. But we kind of had a falling out when his second book came out. I forget the name of it, not the Spirit Molecule, the one of the follow-up to that one.
The Soul of Prophecy?
Yeah, the Soul of Prophecy. And in there, he's saying there's no evidence of ingestion of any sort of entheogenic substance. And I was like, well, Ezekiel eats something. Moses burns an incense. Isaiah, takes a hot coal off, and he got all choked up. But now that's all proven. You know what I mean? It's clear that the Hebrews did use entheogens.
Yeah, who knows? He might be open to that idea. Obviously, there's physical, data now and stuff like that.
I'm sure. Yeah, everybody's got to reassess with that at hand now.
Right,
sure.
And even look at all the DMT research. I don't know if you saw that DMT Quest documentary, but there's a lot of new developments in that field as well. So, even that, with the endogenous stuff and everything. So, when you look at, the way we know about a lot of this stuff is through etymology and languages and all these migration patterns and different things. And it kind of all came from this little turnaround at the top of the Caspian Sea, and then it split off. To my point earlier about it being more of a generic term, do you think that there was an original soma and it was cannabis, but then it, like you mentioned, maybe through telephone and languages and, migrations and stuff, that they had to make do with where they were, or maybe, the cannabis wasn't coming through those trade routes or something along those lines?
Well, like I was saying earlier, I think that, cannabis was a major force in Proto-Indo-European and Indo-European cultures. The term itself is Proto-Indo-European canop, and all of our modern terms, cannabis, bong, chambra, sana, and Sanskrit, all are developed from this Proto-Indo-European term. And we know that Proto-Indo-Europeans were using cannabis in China. They were there from 2000 to 400 BC. My view is that the cannabis that was exported from there, and this was cultivated resin quality cannabis. We know this from the finds in China, that when it was exported from there, it was exported with that name, Huma, right? Mm-hmm. And came into the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex as Huma. That name became Heoma, which is very linguistically similar. And then through other linguistic changes, by the time it reached India, it's Soma. And this has to do with the difference between the Avestan and Vedic languages and how the H is translated and stuff like that. But it's the same word, just one's Vedic and one's Avestan. And that's where I think the term comes from. But this was going on for a long period of time. There were rituals around it. And as the trade routes became inaccessible, you got to remember the Han Chinese chased those Indo-Europeans out of China like 400 BC, right? And there's lots of havoc going on in the whole ancient world spice the spice trail, gets blocked off, right? You know what I mean? And things don't become accessed, but the rituals keep going on. So they talk about this in like the Pathatha Brahmana and other texts later, Vedic period texts about substitutions, and it's just numerous ones of them made. And so it became a situation where it was just ritualized, and through the ritual, whatever was prepared became the sacred beverage, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that was kind of where it left off before, Buddhist reforms. And a lot of the Buddhist reforms were like, all this stuff was heavily taxed. There was all this import tax. Everybody went on a piece of the action. And anything you did in Vedic culture required these elaborate rituals, and you had to pay the priests who performed the ritual. You wanted to get married, you had to hire these Vedic priests to get married. You wanted to do something with your cow there, or get it to get milk. You'd have to do some ritual for that. Everything, and this was real complications around Soma and Hillman. Everybody was trying to get a piece of the action. And this is clear from the descriptions that this was going on for the time period, right? And a big part of like Buddhist reforms was getting rid of all that bullshit. You know what I mean? Because it was complicating life all over the place, right?
Right.
And so it was moving away from all that complicated over ritualization or something like that. Be like, having the Catholic Church involved with every aspect of your daily existence,
Yeah. So, and actually, I thought that could have been added to the immortality key. That whole evolution of, if you look at the origins of like two major religions and religious texts that came out of that, the Rig Veda and the Avesta, like that whole migration produced that, and it's all based on one word that was split off too. So it comes from pressing stock mixed with like a ritual. So if that's not, that should have been the catalyst or that is the catalyst, I think, for obviously a lot of the stuff that we think of when we think of these things. And obviously there's was stuff going on before that, and like we mentioned, the cave art, and even there's like weird time periods, like you go 8,000 BC to 4,000 BC, and there's not a lot known about that stretch of time either. So we just found Göbekli Tepe. This thing's 12,000 years or 11,600 years old. So not a lot's known about that, but I think it is interesting that those were the origins. Both of those religions and cultures came from this pressing of this stock, and you could easily say, obviously, that it's the hemp stock or the cannabis stock.
Well, and we know, like from archaeological evidence, that cannabis was both drank and inhaled, burnt in Indo-European, Proto-Indo-European cultures going back thousands of years. You know what I mean? Going back 5,500 years. So
what about that thing like a priest walks by down the aisle and like the smoke with the incense? Do you think at some point that there might have been cannabis in there?
Well, you mean like in the Christian church?
I don't know what those things are called. They're like swinging like balls that like...
Well, frankincense, generally, the Catholic Church, the incense censers. Well, I don't know about it. Not in the Catholic Church. I think that the Catholic Church is like where all this shit disappears, right? You know what I mean? When the Catholic
there's even a
Church
precursor, right? All that stuff came from a lot of Sumerian and ancient Egyptian ritual stuff as well.
Yeah, well, my view is like, Gnosticism, there's clear references to entheogenic substances in Gnosticism. Gnosticism is like this blanket term for a number of different Gnostic Christian sects: Sethians, Valentians, Marconians. There's all these different Ophites, Manichaeans, but they were all kind of Christian. But they're kind of like New Age religions, and they combine things like Manichaeism. Jesus is worshipped alongside Zoroaster and Buddha and things like that. And in many ways, it's a reversal of a lot of Jewish cosmology. The Yahweh of the Old Testament is not a good figure in a lot of Gnostic beliefs. But in Gnosticism, it's pretty clear that there's entheogenic use, and it's infused wines and other ways, right? I was talking about, these Hebrew references to this term cannabosum, which I was suggesting was cannabis, and now has been fortified by this archaeological evidence out of Arad, Jerusalem from the 8th century BCE. And in the references to cannabosum, God, who first appears from flames of fire from within a burning bush, commands Moses to make this holy anointing oil with about 2.5 pounds of cannabosum, which we're saying is cannabis, but in modern translations of the Bible, going back to the Vulgate when it was first translated into Greek and Latin and stuff like that, that this has been translated as calamus or fragrant cane. But this etymologist, Chris Bennett, in the 30s said this was a reference to cannabis. So he commands Moses to make this holy anointing oil with this cannabosum, myrrh, and cinnamon. And every time Moses is to speak to the Lord, he places this oil on the altar of incense, and he speaks to the Lord in a pillar of smoke over the altar of incense, right? He's in this, like, we know this, like, temple site in Arad, it's like the size of a walk-in closet, you know?
Right.
And so it just gets completely full of smoke, and Moses is sitting there, oh, God, what should we do? And in good Julian Jaynes fashion, a voice comes out of the smoke. This is what you must do. Go tell the Israelites this. And Moses comes out of the tent of the meeting. None of the other Israelites ever see or hear Moses. And he says, this is what God says we must do. And the other Israelites, they only know that Moses is talking to God if they see the smoke is coming out of this little tent of the meeting, this little enclosed structure, right? Now, this holy anointing oil is a very important thing, right? In Hebrew, the one who received it was referred to as the Messiah. This means the anointed one. And at first it was just limited to the high priest, but then later kings were anointed with this. And the term Christ is the Greek translation of the Hebrew term Messiah and makes direct reference to the same anointing oil that contained cannabosum. And we have evidence from the 4th century AD of topical and burnt cannabis being used for medical purposes. And this healing oil of Jesus is both medical and entheogenic. In the oldest of the synoptic gospels, you got to remember, Jesus doesn't ever baptize anybody. But in the oldest of the synoptic gospels, Mark, he's given holy oil to the 12 apostles, and they go out and cast out demons and heal the sick with the holy oil. Casting out demons, probably a reference to epilepsy, because epilepsy was thought to be demonic possession up until medieval times. Paracelsus, the alchemist, actually has a cannabis-infused wine for epilepsy. And Assyrian references to the hand of ghost, which is thought to be a reference to, you know, the possession aspect of epilepsy, required topical cannabis for getting rid of it. And we see right now in our own time, parents all over the place with children suffering from deadly epilepsy, finding relief and thinking they've seen a miracle in cannabis. You know what I mean? That's happening right now.
Yeah, that's a throwback to that the GW Pharma company. They were the first ones to give the child the CBD stuff.
Yeah. So you know that's real, right? And in John in the New Testament, it says, you know, if you've received the anointing, you require no teacher. And this is a big conflict in the Gnostic texts. One of the big divisions between what became the Catholic Church, who gave us the New Testament, and these Gnostics, whose own books were hidden and banned, was water baptism versus anointing oil. In the Gnostic text, they say specifically there's only water.
Yeah, the Essenes kept all that stuff separate and hidden away.
Yeah, they said there's only water in the baptism, but there's fire in the anointing oil. And they say through it we're initiated into unfading bliss. And they refer to it as the plant of kindness, right? And there's also references to these same sort of cannabis-infused wines. And the church fathers even compare these to the Magi's wines. When Marcus the Gnostic is using this cannabis-infused wine and this ritual sex magic, it's a big vivid description. And it's clearly an entheogenic preparation of some sort used to invoke grace, a Eucharist, a Gnostic Eucharist. It brings the blood of the goddess grace into those that drink it. And through that, they're able to speak forth with prophecy, right? It's all very, very interrelated. You know, this is really interrelated, you know, really gets into being close to Hilma because of the big Zoroastrian influence here. Like I said, there's texts where, like the Book of Jude, which has got loads of references to like putting vine branches in wine, burning incense that contained a wonder. And this is all Jesus performing these rituals, right? And he refers specifically to Zoroaster, you know. So, you know, this is right in these texts, and this brings it right into relation to Hilma and these earlier types of things. I think, you know, what we're really witnessing here through archaeology, and I'm sure there's more to come, since they've tested that altar in Iraq, they've been doing more sampling like that of ancient sites and relics and things like that. I think what we're witnessing here is the rebirth of the sacrament of the ancient world. You know what I mean? And it's like a paradigm shift for people. The information about the role of entheogenic substances in the ancient religion, particularly in regards to like Soma and Heoma, the foundations of the Vedic and the Western religions, Hinduism, Zoroastrianism, and you got to think how these interrelate with all the other religions, Buddhism and all that type of shit. And then also this evidence coming up with the biblical stuff. I think when it's understood, it's as much a threat to fundamental religion as Darwin's theory of evolution was to the myths of creation and Genesis, because what it shows is the plant-based origins of these religions. And these religions went around, particularly when we're talking about the Abrahamic religions, destroying this type of shit every time they came into contact with it, whether it being at the inception of the Dark Ages in the 4th century when all the Gnostic sects and pagan sects that used entheogens were suppressed, or the medieval period when witches were burnt at the stake for using sacred plants, or when they came to the New World and they persecuted people for using sacred mushrooms, and peyote, or in Africa with iboga, where this was all considered paganism and devil worship. And now here we're finding out, that their very own prophets were the counterparts of these ancient witch doctors and shamans.
So what do you think, though, about, you've researched all this stuff. You're obviously into these topics. These ancient people believed that there was these entities or spirits or demons, all these different, angels, all sorts of different stuff. Where do you think, how do you think about it? Do you think that
I probably sound like an atheist to a lot of the people that are.
I'm just saying, do you look at it?
I'm giving that kind of explanation of that, but
yeah, but I'm saying,
I said it.
I was gonna say, do you think though, because you could even go with the whole DMT entities and psychedelic entities, and their people are experiencing what they feel like is an external presence or source.
Well, I don't believe in discarnate entities myself. You know what I mean?
So you think it's our subconscious,
and you could be in my dream, but that doesn't mean you're in my dream, right? You know what I mean? And it all seems pretty real as any sort of drug experience, right? So I don't believe in that, but I do believe in a collective consciousness, and in that we're all connected to God, in a sense that we're all Shiva's dream, And I said at the beginning of the program that I'd had this mystical experience under cannabis, and I should probably tell you about that because I'm not an atheist. I'm not an atheist. And what happened, this was in the early, 1989, 1990. And at that time, I lived in this little fishing town on the west coast of Vancouver Island. I was a surfer. I grew cannabis, but my whole trip was kind of based around surfing. And I had this job a few nights a week as a night watchman. A series of events took place that kind of brought me to have this religious experience. And the first of these was there was a real big scandal here in Canada involving a Catholic orphanage called Mount Cashel. And kids that had been there were growing up and saying, I was molested by priests. And this was the first time anybody had ever talked about this in the press, right? And it was whoa, what is this? And I was I wasn't really brought up too religious, but I thought Christianity was a lot different. I'm going to read the Bible. I just don't get this shit. And I started reading the Bible, and when I was at work as a night watchman, I just couldn't get into it. I stuck it in this night watchman office and forgot about it. Another thing that happened was there was a big environmental protest where I lived about the logging of the last coastal old-growth rainforest, Blackwood Sound. And I worked in the forest, and my brother was the youth for the loggers and shit, right? And coinciding with this, a friend of mine, he taped a documentary about hemp. At that time, even the word hemp had been forgotten. Nobody used that term anymore, you know what I mean? And it was all about the industrial applications. And he told me about it. I was like, oh, this is bullshit. And then I saw it, and I was like, oh, wow, And at that time in Canada, you couldn't even get Grow Books or High Times. All that shit had been banned. And so I started looking up in encyclopedias and finding out you could make paper from hemp and fuel and fiber. And I was like, oh, that's really interesting. And then another thing that happened was the Gulf War had started in Iraq, and Saddam Hussein had fired a Scud missile into Israel. And because Babylon was where Iraq is, people were comparing Saddam Hussein to Nebuchadnezzar, the last king of Babylon. He was right into this. And he attacked the Jews, like Nebuchadnezzar, who overthrew the Jews, right? And so one day I'm in this fish plant about 2 a.m, and I'm sitting in this lunchroom smoking a joint. And in those days, there was no internet or anything. So, like TV guides, all that type of stuff were in the newspaper. And I'm looking through this newspaper, and I see this advertisement for a sermon. I think it was Pat Robertson. And it was Revelations 18, the fall of Babylon. And behind him, he had pictured tanks and jets. And I was like, oh, wow, these fucking guys are tying in the book of Revelation with this Gulf War. And I thought, well, I'm going to go read the book of Revelation right now. This is like 1990. So, right, people are kind of peaked for that kind of mentality with 2000 coming up, right? Mm-hmm. And so I get the book, I get the Bible I had in there, and I start reading the book of Revelation. And the beginning of the story, John is given a scroll, and he puts it in his mouth, and it tastes as sweet as honey. And when he swallows it, it turns bitter in his stomach, and he begins to prophesy. And I was like, what did that dude eat? And then I read a little bit further on, and they're talking about how they were wearing sackcloth, and they were given much incense to offer. And the incense contained the prayers of the saints. And I was like, well, this is tripping me right out, all this billowing smoke and incense and shit. And I got to the end of the Bible, Revelations 22, and I read the verse. On either side of the river of life stood the tree of life, bearing 12 manners of fruit, yielding its fruit each month. And the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. And when I read that, I had this feeling like light just poured into my body. And that this was a reference to cannabis and all these fruits where it's industrial applications, it's paper to save our old growth forests, it's fuel to move away from fossil fuels, it's seed to feed the world with one of the most digestible forms of protein known. And, all these different manifold uses, and it's leaves for the healing of the nation. And I was like, whoa, man. And, I called my wife up, and she thought I was having some sort of mental breakdown. She started just like bawling her head off. And the next day I got up and I was like, fuck, man, was there anything to that? Was I just like, did I just trip out and have some sort of mental breakdown, or what the fuck happened? And I would look out my window at these clear-cut mountains, and I thought, for sure, I believe in this hemp stuff. So I'm going to start promoting that for sure. And if there's anything else to this religious aspect, then somebody somewhere else will know something about this, and there'll be stuff about it. And so I slowly, and I'm a high school dropout, man. I hadn't written anything at that time. This is when I was like 27 years old, and here we are like 31 years later, man. And I'm saying to you that cannabis is that tree of life.
And this guy's got a bunch of books out there, folks. Dreams do come true.
Yeah. And
Preach
so that was
now.
the pivotal moment of my life. It was like, before that, I was somebody different. After that, I was given this mission, and I just kind of fucking stuck my nose to the fucking grinder. And, I can't say I've always been true in my relationships with people in life. And, I haven't always been there for people, individually. But this one thing, man, I've stayed true to completely for like 30 odd years now. And it's real, man. And it's manifesting itself in ways that I could not imagine. You know what I mean?
Telos or purpose. That was your calling.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting story. Now, I guess back to my question though. So you said you kind of have like a collective conscious, or maybe like a panpsychism, or like the universe is conscious, or something along those lines. So what do you think these entities are? Like our subconscious, or?
I think it's the way that interacts with us. You know what I mean? It's like archetypes. You know what I mean? That's us. I think it's more like, Jung called it the collective unconscious. I think that there is, in a very real sense, this collective aspect is aware of itself. The Gnostics, and, you got to remember, Jung was deeply influenced by Gnosticism. They called it anthropos, the spirit of humanity. And the Kabbalah, it's kind of like Adam Kadmon, and it's like this collective aspect of humanity. But
yeah,
I have weird, synchronistic experiences where somebody brings me something I'm looking for. They have no way of knowing, and it's not their purpose for doing it, but it's like this collective aspect of consciousness is working through various individuals, or maybe I'm schizophrenic. I don't know.
No, I mean, you sound like just somebody that's passionate, that's done a lot of research, that's had, like you just mentioned, like a personal experience that was kind of like a catalyst for all this. So, I mean, I don't, I like hearing people's personal stories because they usually involve the catalyst of like where that person's passion or, you know, what was the turning point that made you get into this kind of stuff. So it's kind of a generic question when you do, you know, interviews. I hate when they focus too long on it, but I think that stuff like this, I think it's very interesting. And to anybody that's interested in Gnosticism, there's a great courses on Audible that I love that has tons of information. It's Gnosticism from Nag Hammadi to the Gospel of Judas, and they go through, you know, Valentinus, all the whole Gnosticism and the different versions, and Yaldabaoth Oath and the Demiurge, and I think also Elaine Pagels has written a few books on the subject as well.
Miguel Conner has a great Gnostic podcast called Aeon Bite as well. Has a lot of Gnostic scholars on it and stuff.
Awesome. So yeah, I think that this has been, you know, a fascinating look at this topic. Is there anything else you want to add as far as like you know, from an evidence point of view for?
Yeah, well, I'm interested to see what other stuff, you know, I don't know, maybe come back and talk about it. And
I'm going to go through all the
some of these things.
Yeah, I mean, you're more than welcome to come back on and discuss after we're done. I mean, like I kind of put my thought on it out there already, which is I think it's more of like a psychedelic, you know, or a psychoactive compound mixed with a ritual. You know, I name my institute. I have this retreat center we talked about earlier, Soma Institute, and when I use the term Soma in there, I'm using it kind of as a generic term for entheogen. You know what I mean? It's like it's become a definite kind of generic entheogenic term. You know what I mean? But you know, the whole point of this series that we're doing is I want to just put the most credible stuff, you know, have your take, you know, like I said, I've made Venn diagrams and charts of migrations and the etymology and all that stuff. Just put that stuff out there, and I want the listeners to decide, because I think when people go off and do their own research, it leads to more breakthroughs, or somebody makes this connection that wasn't made before, and I think that we need more of that and less definite opinions. And, you know, I don't know how anybody can stick to any one idea. I used to kind of feel that way, but now I feel like you just have to always be willing to evolve. You know, obviously certain stuff that you've done, like historical research and stuff like that, you can point to certain things, but I think that when you look at the evolution of science and, you know, the philosophy of science, and you have to always be willing to kind of, you know, move or keep pushing that boulder up the mountain kind of a thing. So
things change, you know what I mean? It's like sometimes scientists have to give up their theories and in relation to new stuff. Like that's what happened with the Proto-Indo-European homeland. You know, there was a big theory that it was Anatolia, and another theory that it was Western steppes, and it ruined the relationship between the people behind it, Sir Colin Renfrew, and it's this. I can't remember the name of the woman. It's that
name sounds familiar.
Wendy Doniger, who did Wasson's book, said the steppes. And then the DNA evidence, you know, they tested large swaths of Indian population. It documented that they came out of the steppes.
That Colin Renfrew, I think we made a short video on like the origins of ancient Greece, like the lead in from Mycenae into the civilization. And, you know, I want to say he's been investigating, or was part of archaeology, or archaeological dig going on investigating the site. I think it's Doskaleo. It's this like pyramid looking island off the coast of Karos Island in the Cyclades. And that Cycladic culture, I mean, the statues are very similar looking to the Nuragi people from Sardinia, and also the Urfa man from Göbekli Tepe. So obviously, you know, the cradle of civilization, all that kind of stuff spread out from there. But yeah, interesting stuff. What about
it is,
what about when you look at these, you know, there's all these different theories. Everybody, you know, it's psilocybin, it's, you know, ayahuasca analog, it's, you know, it's phalaris grass and Pegamum harmala, or you know, who knows? There's so many different psychoactive compounds out there. I think you do have to like focus on the region when you're talking about these things too. You know, like what was going around in that region of the Caspian Sea there? What was the what did the region look like at the time? Like, what was the climate? Was it similar to how it is today? You know, I think you have to kind of look at all that stuff too, you know, the flooding patterns and all that kind of stuff. So, but when you look at this stuff, are you 100% convinced that it's cannabis, or at least cannabis was involved through most of it?
Through Soma and him, absolutely.
Okay.
You know, up until, you know, like the whole thing gets lost, and then like Indra all of a sudden is kind of like almost pushed right out of the path. He doesn't play a very important role anymore. He was the king of the gods, and everything goes over to Shiva. And I think this is where the cannabis, the Soma becomes more of a bong type of thing. You know what I mean? And it's attributed to Shiva. And this is in the myth of the churning of the ocean of milk. And in that myth, Indra insults an aspect of Shiva, and this brings down a curse on the three worlds. And so Shiva, Vishnu, and Krishna go see Brahma, and Brahma says, oh, what you need to do is get potent herbs. Then you must go to the ocean of milk, and you need the mountain maru and this giant snake to churn it like a churning stick. And you throw the potent herbs in the ocean of milk, and then you churn it with the mountain and the snake. And it's such a big job. You got to get all the demons to help you. And so they go and they do this. And this is where you got to get the Amrita. And Amrita is a counterpart of Soma. Amrita is interesting because it has a Greek counterpart, ambrosia. They come from the same root.
Right.
And some see it as
milk of the gods.
Of a connection. Yeah. And so they go and they churn it, and they eventually get the Amrita. And but first the poison comes out. Shiva drinks the poison, saves the world, turns blue. His neck turns blue. But then the Amrita comes out, and to save it from the demons that help them, the Garuda bird flies off with it. Now, drops from the cup of the Amrita fall on earth, and these are the spots that the Kumbh Mela is held today. And it's also said that cannabis, referred to in this case as Vajaje, a Sanskrit term that means victory, in honor of Shiva's victory, sprouted from these same spots. You know what I mean? And you can go to the Kumbh Mela today, and everybody's taking cannabis in honor of Shiva. And Indra's like not even, really mentioned it at all in any of this, right? And so this is where this is kind of transitioned into more of a folksy sort of relationship with the sacred beverage, where it didn't have to go through all that Vedic ritual, and even the poor and everybody can kind of take part in it more equally, right?
Right.
And this seems to be in the transition from Indra worship over to Shiva worship, where Shiva's kind of almost the main figure in the pantheon now.
Yeah, and it says that both Homa and Soma are both grown in the mountains, but their origins are heaven. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's like the heavenly Soma, you know what I mean? That's what I mean, like the cup in the sky is full of the heavenly Soma, right? You know what I mean? And so the earthly Soma is what we drink, and that's its earthly counterpart.
And we know, cannabis in, some elevation is actually quite productive, so.
Oh, yeah, well, this is where these Indo-Europeans in China, they were up high on mountains,
Right. And
they were growing quality cannabis.
Do you think you mentioned earlier, but do you think they knew the difference between, the female and producing, not necessarily seedless, but less seeds or more of a bud?
I don't know if I don't think they knew about producing seedless cannabis, because there's no evidence of that. But they certainly were selecting the female flowers. The bouquet was all female flowers on the mummy. And in the case of the processed cannabis, it was all female cannabis flowers, that had been picked through and stuff like that. So they definitely knew that, and it was definitely cannabis that had been cultivated for its psychoactivity,
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I'm so close to this, the cannabis, because I use it. It's tough. Like when I first started researching this, it was tough for me to accept that as a possibility, just because
We're so used to it.
Yeah, and it just seemed like so like the beginning of the Rig Veda and the Avesta, and like these are pivotal points, and the things that they're saying in there seemed so grandiose that
take a look at like jazz music, Reefer Man,
right.
Of the Mile High, or hip hop music. And this is like, I think, a really important thing here is like, the relationship between cannabis and hip hop music, how it brings on that rap kind of spirit, man. It's like, this is like not just with hip hop, reggae music. There's like a whole Colombian genre. There used to be a Greek form of jazz, rambagata, which was really hashish infused jazz music. This is not the first time that cannabis has played an influence of music, right?
Even the merry pranksters would sit around and they call it rapping, where they would smoke or take psychedelics.
And this is the role that it was. Like a lot of, not just the Vedas and the Avesta are written in poetry. A lot of the texts of the Bible are also written in poetry. And this is something that Julian Jaynes was saying is like by throwing in a certain beat, repetitive beat, and you get into kind of a sort of right brain trance, and then the words kind of start coming out. And this is a way a lot of the religious literature was composed. It would have been like people burning cannabis in a temple or drinking bong, and there's music, drums playing, beats going, and then people start kind of getting into a trance, and they start throwing words out, and there's other people writing all that shit down. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And this is like kind of how this stuff was produced, bringing it up out of ourselves, invoking that muse, that enthusiasm, which means possession. You know what I mean? Genius, which comes from the same root as genie, and means guardian angel, basically. We invoke that, we bring it out, and we get thrown into that, and then that same aspect that tells us our dreams at night starts coming out and laying down shit for us.
Yeah. Also, too, I mean, when you look at, I just, like I said, it seemed maybe again because we're viewing it from like the modern version, and we know what real psychoactive and psychedelic compounds can do now. We have a real understanding of where they come from and how they affect us, and even though there's been a prohibition on them for some time now, since the late 70s, it looks like that's about to change with all the psychedelic science and the people getting all the stock stuff going, and it seems like there's a changing of the tide with all that. But I think it was in I can't remember if it was an electric Kool-Aid acid test or On the Road. My mind's kind of going blank, but he talks about combining smoking with taking speed, and how that's
the acid test.
Okay, the acid
crack
test.
The door open. Is that
it kind of is like the first or like oncoming effects of like LSD in some regards, like that combination. So if you had cannabis with ephedra, it might even resemble an early stage LSD trip or something like that.
Yeah. People got to really, keep in mind too the potency of ingested cannabis. It can be very, very powerful. Try eating a couple of grams of bubble hash and see where that takes you. You know what I mean? And, it can be as powerful as any other psychedelic if it's used in those sorts of doses levels.
Yeah, I remember eating
I'm fully scared to do it again.
I remember eating a cinnamon roll. I think I talked about this on maybe one of our trip report episodes, but I ate a full cinnamon roll. Afterwards I ate it, and for like a day I was like on a different planet, and like something went wrong with the butter because I was sitting on the toilet half the time too, and the whole thing was just a mess. Brutal. And I remember calling my buddy the next day. He's like, "Dude, you were supposed to take like a bite or two. You ate the whole thing, So, you can, now, we've done. If anybody's a secret escapee, we did an episode where I ate 200 milligrams and did the episode, and it was kind of normal. I have.
Well, you can get used to these things. For sure. You know what I mean? You do it enough times.
But yeah, for a beginner, you want like 5-10 max. For somebody. That's why these things go wrong, and you see these stories in the news and everything, is because people don't understand it's a completely different thing than smoking.
Yeah, and setting plays a big role here too. You know what I mean? It's like. These people aren't like, oh, you want to try some marijuana? You already heard lots about it. It's a known thing, There's few people ever try it without knowing nothing about it. You know what I mean? It's so well known.
Right.
And for most of these people back then, it was like, it was like a big moment, man. You know what I mean? It was like they didn't know what to expect, and there's a whole ritual aspect being presented to them with it. You know what I mean? And that has a huge effect on any substance. You could even get an effect from placebo with that. You see that with the Eucharistic of the Catholic Church. You know what I mean?
Right.
It's all just hocus pocus. There's no actual psychoactivity there.
Well, a high dose edible in darkness, meditating. I mean, you can go places. I that's that's one of my favorite pastimes. So
there you go.
Yeah, it's interesting stuff. I mean, I if people are interested too, definitely check out his book, Cannabis and the Soma Solution. And obviously he references all of the data and the research that came before him, and he did a great job of citing other people. And also, he's written a bunch of articles on cannabis culture, which I did add the link down below. What is that, a 4 or 5 part?
Yeah, it's a 5-part series. I was actually talking to Graham Hancock and, suggesting that he should present something like that on his site, like calling all candidates for Soma. You know what I mean?
Right.
Let's get a discussion here. I do think it's important, like to keep an open mind, but it's also important to remember not everybody can be right. There is answers to some of these things. You know what I mean? And I think we've got to start there's a lack of critical thinking in the entheogenic scene. I don't even really like going to conferences, psychedelic conferences and stuff anymore, because I think a lot of the stuff that's presented is just crap, man, and there's a real lack of credibility. It's a quack fest. And
it's a new market, though. I think you're going to get that. It's like the same thing.
Yeah, well, that's unfortunate because it shouldn't be that way. This is real history, real religion. You know what I mean? One of the nice things about the Immortality Key is some of the attention he's getting, like from the Harvard History of Religions department. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And stuff like that. And that's where this
more attention on ethnobotany and.
Yeah, it needs to be discussed in, like conferences on Indo-European culture, conferences on the history of religion, and that sort of thing. And it needs to move away from this kind of sideshow freaky thing that has been kind of presented in and moved into mainstream scholarship.
Yeah, I think what it is just people like we mentioned a few times, just basing it off their own experiences and then looking at it through that lens and applying it to ancient text, ancient data, research, whatever you want to call it. And I think that there is some good stuff out there too. I mean, to your point, yeah, I've seen some crazy speculations, but I've also seen some good stuff too. And even in the stuff that isn't so good, there are still some nuggets in there of
There's some great writers, like Tom Hatsis is a good guy. He's got a great book on the witches, ointment, and Western mystery traditions. I'm a good friend of P.D. Newman's. I think he was on here recently.
Yeah, we've had P.D. on a couple
his
times.
Book, Alchemically Stoned. He was a consultant for Liber 420. And when I have questions about Freemasonry, and this is another interesting area where we're seeing entheogenic evidence turning up is in some of these secret societies and stuff like that, where they were using potent elixirs in initiation ceremonies. And I think that maybe have something to offer, is that interface, like kind of trying to re-ritualize some of this stuff to help bring around peak moments, because a lot of it is set and setting.
Absolutely. And I like all the occult stuff too, because if there were people that knew what was going on, it would have been the alchemists who were dabbling with nature and making elixirs and potions and different things. And
well, there's absolute references to cannabis and alchemy. You know what I mean? There's no questions asked. There's Zosimos in the 4th century, kind of like one of the founders of the modern alchemical tradition. He wrote about cannabis and darnel infused in wines and beers in Egypt for magical purposes. Paracelsus used opium. He wrote about cannabis. The Lullian corpus as well refers to cannabis and arcanums and quintessences, which were basically tinctures of one or many plants. Cardano, well-known alchemist as well, wrote about cannabis infusions. Rabelais, who called himself a master of quintessence, which is an alchemical, alcohol-based infusion of herbs, incorporated 3 chapters on cannabis into his classic Gargantua and Pantagruel. So it's clear that in spagyric alchemy, that's alchemy with plants, that cannabis, mandrake, and other psychoactive substances were in use.
Yeah, I'm not really understanding, because we've had, a couple psychedelic scientists on, Matthew Johnson, Andrew Gallimore, and we were discussing, tropanes and how the actual mechanisms of what we know of how they work. And tropane seems like one where you can actually experience things that are not there. It's more of a delusional or a delusion thing than, so that might be, the source of some things. But in terms of it being like when they say, you look at like Plato's explanations at like the Eleusinian mysteries and other, what Alcibiades was doing and the profaning the mysteries and all these different things. The explanations don't make it sound like something recreational or something enlightening. Like when what I know about tropanes is it seems like it's not as pleasant, obviously, as your psilocybe or
it can be downright nightmarish. You know what I mean? It's like but the search for knowledge isn't always bright and pretty either, right?
Right.
Certainly the witches, that's a lot of the dark imagery there was probably due to the types of plants that were in use.
Datura, mandrake,
Yeah. And bane.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. So what are you working on next? Are you working on anything, or you...
I had been working on a book about Aleister Crowley and drugs, but due to the popularity of the Immortality Key, I kind of got sidetracked on that, and my publisher wants me to revisit some of this ancient world stuff in light of some of this new archaeology, like the stuff out of Israel. So I'm kind of trying to summarize some of my earlier work on the ancient world right now in a shorter, more straightforward book. A lot of my stuff is bogged down with footnotes and
I think there's
stuff like that.
No better time.
I'm trying to kind of get something. I'm trying to get something that's a little easier for kind of just the typical lay reader to make their way through with some of the more solid, cold, hard facts that we have now. So I'm working on that currently, and I've got a couple of articles on my blog that are related to that. One on Indo-Europeans and Proto-Indo-Europeans, and another one on Dionysius. The cannabis infused wine of Dionysius is what I'm suggesting. And this is something that Professor Carl Ruckus suggested as well, is that Dionysian wine was a cannabis infusion.
Interesting. Oh. Yeah, I mean, we look forward to that. I think there's no better time. It's a great time to come out with that, obviously, with everything that's going on and this movement, the psychedelic movement and everything like that. Yeah, I think plus what Liber 420 is like 800 pages, which I thoroughly enjoyed, but that's a heavy read for the average reader, especially if you're not into these exact topics. I mean, we're all nerding out here. We're all nerding out here right now, but not everybody, looks at these things. No, I think you should do it. And like you said, the finds that they just found, the cannabis and the incense and all that, and then I think they just found masks too from Israel, that region, from dating to 8,000 or 9,000 BC or something along that.
Oh, wow, yeah.
So
cool.
That basket that they just found too, the oldest basket.
Basket.
Lots of stuff.
Yeah, I've been wondering what material that's been made out of. I was trying to find out.
I'm sure there's probably, I mean, if there's not already, there probably will be a paper.
Yeah. I'm sure.
Well, listen, man, let's wrap it up here. This was a fascinating talk. You've definitely brought a lot to the table, which is knowledge. I know we tried to get you on before, and stuff kind of fell apart. I know you and I were going back and forth on Facebook about, what we were talking about earlier, but I'm glad we finally got you on, and I think that you definitely made the case for cannabis. I don't know if we're going to be able to compete with that with all the other stuff, and I'm not really an advocate for the other possibilities.
I'd like to see a journal come out with, a bunch of different people that are really knowledgeable on the particular candidate, all put their pieces together. Somebody can read them all, you know what I mean, and go over it, and and then maybe a follow-up where everybody picks apart each other's ideas.
It's just an all-out Zoom battle.
Yeah.
Warfare.
Yeah, but so, everybody go check out Chris's blog. I have the link down below from Cannabis Culture. He goes through all of his research and evidence for cannabis being Soma. We also, have the links down below for his books on Amazon. Cannabis, the Soma Solution and Liber 420. And he's got a couple others as well. So check those out. And one more time, head on over to our Patreon at patreon.com/mindscape-podcast. For just $2 a month, you'll get exclusive guest episodes and segments. Again, if you're not a Patreon member, it's just $2 a month. You get a whole catalog of extra segments on any of the guests we've had: Randall Carlson, Avi Loeb, Andrew Gallimore, Peter Scherstedt. You go on there, we've got tons of people on there, so go check that out. And one more time, it's very relevant for this conversation, head on over to Indra's Web. It is live. It is the platform we created to have these kinds of conversations. The ultimate goal is to have more debate-style things going on there. So I like what I'm seeing so far, but head on over to indrasweb.org and sign up for an account today. And again, thank you so much for coming on, Chris, and we'll definitely get you back on. I know there was some other stuff we definitely wanted to talk about that we didn't get to, but hopefully we'll get to that next time we have you on. And everybody stay safe out there.
Lots to talk about, man.
Yeah, we love everybody. Stay safe out there, and we'll catch you next time. Peace.
Peace.